You break your arm, right? You go to the hospital, they take an x-ray, and there's that jagged white line right through the bone.
Yeah, and the doctor just points to the screen and says, well, there it is.
Right. And it's incredibly satisfying, isn't it? I mean, as a patient, you're in pain, you're confused, but that black and white image offers just this absolute, undeniable clarity.
It's binary. I mean, the bone is broken or it's not.
Exactly. It provides a profound sense of comfort because it just removes all the guesswork.
Right, because human beings naturally gravitate toward the visible. We want the problem categorized so we can just apply the fix.
But the moment you zoom out from the human body and you try to diagnose the health of a massive, sprawling entity like a modern nation-state or a global economy...
Oh, the X-ray machine is utterly useless then?
Totally useless. The
Yeah.
diagnostic landscape of geopolitics is just, well, it's an absolute swamp.
It really is.
You have economists pointing to GDP growth, saying, everything is fine. But then sociologists point to wealth disparity and say, no, the system is actually on the brink of total collapse.
Yeah, and you have approval polls, you have military parades, leaders giving these huge speeches about a golden age.
Which creates an incredibly dangerous illusion.
It does. Because a failing societal system can put on a remarkably convincing performance of vitality. I mean, it can leverage debt to build gleaming infrastructure or, manipulate the media to project strength.
Right up until the exact moment the foundations just completely give way.
Exactly. The metrics we traditionally use to measure civilizational health, they are inherently manipulatable.
And that really brings us to the core mission of today's deep dive. If you're listening to this and you've ever felt that underlying anxiety about the systems governing our world.
That feeling that the foundations are rotting beneath the shiny surface.
Yes. If you felt that, you're going to find today's source material incredibly compelling.
Yes.
Because we are exploring a highly analytical, almost clinical commentary on a specific ancient text, we're looking at the final verses of Surah Ar-Ra'd, which is chapter 13 of the Quran.
And we should clarify right up front, the approach the author takes with this commentary is nothing short of a massive paradigm shift.
It really is.
He is entirely discarding the traditional, mystical lens through which these texts are usually viewed. He isn't looking at this chapter as some collection of magical incantations.
Right, or a supernatural document that just demands blind faith.
Precisely. He views the text as a precise sociological blueprint.
He's treating it like an engineering schematic.
That's a perfect way to put it. It's an absolute source code that dictates the rise and fall of human civilizations based on observable, unbending laws.
It's social physics, not theology. And before we get deep into the weeds of these verses, we really need to set a hard boundary for our analysis today.
Good idea.
For you listening, regardless of your personal worldview, whether you're a devout believer, a staunch atheist, an agnostic, whatever, our exploration today is purely analytical.
Right. We are going to deconstruct these ideas exactly as the author presents them.
We are focusing entirely on the intellectual architecture and the systemic claims of the text. We aren't here to preach, and we definitely aren't taking any political or religious sides.
Impartiality is key here.
Exactly. We are just impartially unpacking this fascinating perspective on social engineering, statecraft, and, well, the mechanics of civilizational collapse.
And establishing that neutrality is vital, I think, because the argument this source makes is incredibly audacious.
Oh, it's huge.
The author claims that the ultimate, unmanipulatable proof of a failing societal system isn't found in abstract philosophical debates.
Or economic projections.
Right. The proof is literal. It is drawn geographically on the geopolitical map.
Which brings us to the hook. The text points directly to verse 41 of this chapter, though. The author's specific commentary references it using a different internal numbering system, marking it as 46.14.
Yeah, and this verse makes a very specific, almost strange statement. It talks about the earth contracting from its borders.
Right. Contracting from its borders. And the Arabic word the text hinges on there is atraf.
Now, if you look back at how historical traditional commentators tried to grapple with that phrase, you see a lot of intellectual contortions.
Oh, for sure.
Because they were operating from an ancient, deeply literalist mindset. So they read, the earth contracting from its borders, and immediately jumped to geographical impossibilities.
Like the physical edges of a flat earth just crumbling off into some cosmic abyss.
Exactly. Or, theorizing that the actual landmass of the planet is physically shrinking over time.
Which makes no sense.
Right. They were trying to force a literal geological phenomenon onto a text that, according to our author, is actually speaking the language of macro-sociology.
So the source applies a massive linguistic course correction here. The author digs into the classical roots of that word, atraf.
And what does he find?
Well, it doesn't just mean the physical dirt at the edge of a map. It refers to the extremities of a body. In a geopolitical sense, it means the elites, the prominent leaders, the economic resources, and the peripheral territories of a state's domain.
I love the biological analogy here. Let's apply that to the anatomy of an empire.
Okay, let's do it.
When a human body is thrown into freezing temperatures and the core system can no longer maintain its equilibrium, what happens?
The body undergoes vasoconstriction.
Precisely. It intentionally cuts off blood flow to the fingers, the toes, the extremities, the atraf.
It sacrifices the periphery to keep the central organs alive just a little bit longer.
It's biological triage. It's frostbite.
Frostbite. That is such a vivid way to picture it. And the author is arguing that this text identified the frostbite of human civilizations centuries ago.
Yeah, the shrinking of the Earth isn't a geological event at all. It is the observable shrinking of influence.
It's what happens when a powerful empire's internal operating system just begins to fail. The central government runs out of the functional capacity to manage its vast domains.
So the resources dry up, the outer territories become ungovernable and slip away.
The regional elites lose their grip on the populace, and the empire just contracts inward.
You can map that perfectly onto the fall of the Roman Empire, actually.
Oh, absolutely. Rome didn't vanish overnight because the capital city was suddenly vaporized by a meteor. The contractions started at the edges.
Oh, they had to pull their legions out of Britannia.
Right. The peripheral supply chains broke down. The outer provinces were abandoned to the barbarian tribes. Their domain literally contracted from its borders.
The British Empire experienced the exact same contraction. I mean, at its height, the sun never set on it.
Right.
But as the internal economic and political systems strained under the weight of 2 world wars, the atraf began to break away.
India, the African colonies, their influence in the Middle East.
The core could no longer sustain the periphery. The map contracted.
Which makes the map the ultimate audit. You can lie on a GDP report, but you can't lie about losing control of half your territory.
Exactly.
But, you know, what makes this so fascinating in the context of the source material is who this verse was originally addressing.
The opponents.
Yes, the opponents of the messenger. The established power players arguing against this newly proposed sociological blueprint. And they were demanding a completely different kind of proof.
They didn't want historical audits.
No, they wanted flashy, supernatural miracles. They were essentially saying, if this system is from the divine, make an angel appear, turn this mountain into solid gold.
And that demand reveals a profound flaw in human psychology, I think.
How so?
Well, we crave the spectacular because the spectacular bypasses the intellect.
Oh, that's interesting.
Think about it. If a giant angel descends from the sky and tells you to do something, you don't have to evaluate the logic of the command. You are simply terrified into submission.
You just do it.
Right. We want a magic show to validate a truth so we can completely avoid the arduous, exhausting work of intellectual verification and systemic reform.
I see. But the source highlights how the text flatly rejects that demand for magic. The Quran repeatedly emphasizes that the messenger bringing this blueprint is agonizingly normal.
He's just a guy.
He is entirely human. He has a family. He walks in the dusty markets. He buys goods. He gets sad. There is no glowing aura.
And the author argues that this is highly intentional.
The text is establishing a new paradigm here. You don't need a disruption of the laws of physics when you have the unbreakable laws of sociology.
The text is effectively saying, just look at the map.
Right.
The opponents are demanding a supernatural disruption. But the text is offering the unyielding consistency of historical data.
The true miracle isn't a mountain turning to gold.
No, it is the absolute empirical predictability that a flawed, unjust system will inevitably lose its grip on power.
Let's unpack this with a modern analogy. Think of a massive, failing corporate monopoly. The people invested in the old, failing system, they want a PR campaign. They want a charismatic CEO doing tricks on stage to prove the company is still viable.
Right. The flashy presentation.
Exactly. But the undeniable audit is that their market share is being slowly eaten by a better system. You don't need a magic trick to prove they are failing. The map itself is the audit.
And that transition from the mystical to the empirical forces, the listener and the historical opponents, to confront a much more terrifying reality.
Which is?
If the contraction of an empire isn't caused by angry gods throwing lightning bolts, but by internal systemic flaws, then those flaws can be diagnosed.
And if they can be diagnosed, they can be judged. Which brings us to a really critical question for this deep dive.
Okay, what's that?
If the map proves the system is dying of frostbite, what exactly caused the core temperature to drop in the first place? I mean, what is the fatal flaw that guarantees this contraction?
The author locates the answer to that in his analysis of verse 36.
All right, let's get into it.
He identifies the root cause of systemic civilizational collapse as the phenomenon of partial adoption.
Verse 36 talks about groups of people who rejoice at the revelation, but then it specifically mentions factions that deny or reject a part of it.
Right. And to explain why accepting only a piece of the blueprint is so lethal, the author uses a medical analogy that is incredibly vivid.
Oh, I love this analogy. Walk us through it.
It's a masterclass in explaining systemic equilibrium. So the author asks us to imagine a brilliant physician who diagnoses a patient with a severe, complex illness.
Okay, sick patient, smart doctor.
The physician formulates a highly calibrated, multi-ingredient prescription. Now, some of the active ingredients in this medicine are incredibly powerful. They are designed to aggressively attack the disease.
They're the heavy hitters.
Exactly. But because they're so potent, they have harsh, potentially dangerous side effects on the body's organs.
Like they might cure the disease but destroy your liver in the process.
Exactly. So the physician, understanding the holistic ecosystem of the human body, includes specific secondary ingredients in the prescription.
The antidotes.
Yes. These antidotes are carefully measured to perfectly neutralize the toxic side effects of the active drugs. They maintain the body's equilibrium while the disease is eradicated.
It's a closed-loop system, you know. Every single part relies on the other parts to function safely.
But then the patient takes this complex formulation home, opens it up, and decides to be their own pharmacist.
Never a good idea.
No. They taste the mixture and realize that the antidotes are incredibly bitter, while the active ingredients actually have a pleasant, sweet taste.
Or maybe they just feel that taking 6 different compounds every morning is too much work.
Right. So, based entirely on personal preference and immediate convenience, they decide to only ingest the sweet-tasting components, and they just throw away the bitter antidotes.
The inevitable result being that the medicine itself becomes a fatal poison.
Exactly. By stripping out the balancing agents, the patient allows the active ingredients to tear their internal organs apart.
This is the exact mechanism the author uses to explain the failure of societies that engage in partial adoption of a comprehensive societal blueprint.
A true constitutional system, whether we are talking about this specific divine text or any foundational charter of governance, is an ecosystem.
It has built-in checks, balances, and counterweights. Give me a practical example of how that translates to a state, though. Like, how does a nation actually discard the bitter antidote?
Sure. Imagine a foundational blueprint that mandates a highly robust social welfare system. Free healthcare, housing assistance, universal basic income.
Okay, that is a deeply appealing, sweet concept to the populace. Everyone wants free healthcare.
Of course. But that same blueprint to prevent total economic collapse and the draining of the public treasury also mandates an incredibly harsh, unforgiving penal code against political corruption, tax evasion, and bureaucratic theft.
I see. That is the bitter antidote.
Yes. So a society comes along and says, well, we love the social welfare aspect. It wins us elections. We will adopt that 100%.
But this strict penal code, it's too harsh.
Right, they say. It offends our modern sensibilities. Let's discard that part.
And by adopting the economic drain without the strict anti-corruption safeguards,
the treasury is looted, the economy hyperinflates, and the entire state collapses.
the medicine became poison.
Because they destroyed the equilibrium. They thought they were just making a minor edit to suit their preferences, but they actually sabotaged the entire engine.
And what's really striking is that the author points this analytical weapon directly at modern geopolitics.
He really goes after it.
He explicitly critiques the concept of modern hybrid states, specifically nations that call themselves Islamic republics or states that try to blend divine law with secular democratic mechanics.
And we need to be highly precise with our definitions here, just as the source is. When the author critiques secular democracy in this specific context, he is not attacking the concept of voting.
Right, or public consultation.
He is targeting the foundational mechanism of sovereignty. The idea that a 51% majority opinion in a parliament holds the ultimate authority to override, alter, or ignore the foundational immutable constitutional law.
This is the core friction. You have a nation that writes a constitution claiming, the absolute divine principles of this text are the supreme law of the land.
But then, right next door, they set up a parliament.
Exactly. And they say, however, if 51% of these politicians decide that a specific divine principle is economically inconvenient this decade, they can just vote to suspend it.
The author views this as an attempt to mix oil and water. It creates a fundamentally contradictory operating system.
And he uses a very heavy, historically loaded theological term to describe this specific political contradiction. He calls it shirk.
Now, if you are familiar with traditional theology, shirk is almost always translated as polytheism, the associating of partners with God.
Right, the immediate mental image is primitive. People bowing down to physical statues carved out of wood or stone, worshiping multiple deities.
But the author elevates that definition entirely out of the literal and into the systemic. He argues that shirk isn't about statues at all, it's about dual sovereignty.
Shirk, in the realm of statecraft, is the act of mixing human legislative sovereignty with divine legislative sovereignty.
Exactly. If a state declares that a universal blueprint is the ultimate authority, but then inserts a clause saying, except when a majority of humans vote otherwise,
They have literally associated a partner with the ultimate authority.
they have created two competing absolute sources of law within one closed system.
It's systemic schizophrenia.
Yeah,
The legal code is constantly at war with itself. But, I have to push back here.
go for it.
Because this goes against everything we are taught in modern political science. I mean, the universal wisdom of contemporary governance is that compromise is the highest virtue.
That's the standard thinking, yes.
You build a coalition, you take a little from the conservative side, a little from the progressive side, you find the middle ground, and that is how you maintain peace in a diverse society.
But the author is arguing that this kind of compromise is fatal.
How so?
The author would argue that modern political science is diagnosing the wrong problem. Compromise is necessary when you are dealing with flawed, human-created theories that are inherently biased.
Right, if two people are arguing over a blind guess, they should probably meet in the middle.
But if you are dealing with a perfectly calibrated blueprint, a true source code for human flourishing compromise is no longer a virtue.
It's like an aerospace engineer designing a jet engine.
Precisely. If an engineering team designs a perfectly balanced jet engine, you don't bring in a focus group of passengers to vote on which parts to keep.
You can't look at the blueprints and say, well, the titanium and turbine blades are really over our budget. Let's compromise and build 10% of them out of 10.
And let's remove the backup fuel pump because the majority feels it takes up too much space.
Right. If you do that, the plane doesn't just fly a little bit slower. It catastrophically disintegrates at 30,000 feet.
You expect the compromised engine to fly, but the physics of the system guarantee a disaster. Partial adoption of a precision instrument is guaranteed sabotage.
Okay, that logic holds up, but it immediately creates a massive vulnerability for the author's argument.
Which is?
For a societal blueprint to demand 100% adherence without a single compromise, that blueprint cannot be vague.
Ah, yes.
If a constitution is written in flowery, poetic metaphors that can be interpreted in 20 different ways, depending on who is sitting on the Supreme Court, then partial adoption isn't sabotage, it's just human interpretation.
That's a very fair point.
If it demands absolute compliance, it must be an absolute precision instrument. Does the source actually claim this ancient text is that precise?
That is exactly the hurdle the author tackles next. He moves into a deep linguistic analysis of verse 37.
And what does verse 27 say?
It describes the revelation using a very specific phrase, an Arabic judgment, or hukman Arabian.
Now, when you hear Arabic judgment, the immediate assumption is geographical or demographic.
Right? You think it's a set of laws delivered to people in the Arabian Peninsula, spoken in their local dialect so they could understand it.
But the author vigorously attacks that surface-level reading, doesn't he?
He does. He argues that reducing hukman Arabian to a mere linguistic identifier misses the entire mechanical purpose of the phrase.
So what is the mechanical purpose?
Well, he traces the root etymology of the word Arab back to its most ancient origins. Before it was an ethnic identifier, the root meaning of the word implied absolute eloquence, crystal clarity, and a complete lack of ambiguity.
He contrasts this with the historical counterpart, the term ajam.
Yes. Historically, the Arabs used the word ajam to describe non-Arabs. But the linguistic root of ajam doesn't mean foreigner.
What does it mean?
It means someone who's mute, or someone whose speech is garbled, unclear, mumbling, or obscured.
So when the text defines itself as Hukm Arabian, it's not saying, hey, this is the desert law.
No, it's making a structural claim. It is declaring itself a judgment of absolute rational clarity.
It is claiming to be the exact opposite of Ajam. It contains no mumbling, no vague loopholes, no poetic obscurities that allow a corrupted judge to twist the meaning to serve a political agenda.
It is a precision instrument.
But wait, language is inherently fluid, right? Words change meaning over centuries. How can any text, no matter how eloquently written, act as a precision instrument for modern social physics without requiring layers of human interpretation? Interpretation that inevitably dilutes that clarity.
The author's counter-argument is that the structural grammar and root-based system of classical Arabic was uniquely preserved precisely to prevent that semantic drift.
Like the blueprint is locked in a linguistic vault.
Exactly. A law that can be interpreted in 10 contradictory ways isn't a law, it's a suggestion. The author argues the Quranic text functions as a mathematical formula. If you input the correct linguistic variables, the output is functionally singular.
And this demand for absolute rational clarity leads the author to dismantle one of the most prominent, deeply entrenched concepts in traditional historical jurisprudence.
You're talking about NASC.
Yes, the theory of abrogation.
This is where the sources analysis becomes incredibly radical compared to orthodox historical consensus.
Walk us through it. What is NASC?
For centuries, traditional jurists operated on this theory of NASC. The theory suggests that certain verses of the Quran literally cancel out, override, or abrogate other verses within the same text.
And the usual explanation for this is progressive revelation, right?
Yeah, the idea that God gave an early community a temporary rule, and then later, when the community matured or circumstances changed, God sent a new verse to overwrite the old one.
So God essentially changed his mind.
It treats the ultimate blueprint like a rust draft covered in red ink and crossouts.
Which completely shatters the idea of a Hukm Arabian. If parts of the text are void, it's not a timeless precision instrument.
Exactly. And the author rejects the theory of abrogation with absolute ferocity. He argues that NASC is an entirely human invention.
It's a loophole.
It is a fabricated loophole created by later generations of jurists and scholars who found themselves under immense political pressure.
Give me the historical context on that. Why would a scholar invent a theory to cross out part of their own holy book?
Imagine you are a chief jurist in a massive, sprawling empire in the 9th century. The Caliph, the absolute monarch, wants to enact a specific taxation policy. Or maybe you launch a military campaign that clearly violates a foundational verse of the Quran.
Okay, high stakes.
As the jurist, you have a choice. You can tell the emperor he is breaking divine law, which might literally cost you your head. Or you can invent a jurisprudential mechanism to bypass the law.
Ah, I see. You say, Your Majesty, don't worry about that verse prohibiting your actions. That verse was actually abrogated by this other, vaguer verse.
Exactly. Abrogation became the ultimate tool for partial adoption. It allowed the elite to mathematically remove the bitter antidotes from the Constitution while maintaining the illusion of total piety.
That is fascinating, and the author points out the fatal logical flaw here. A divine source code, by definition, must be internally applicable.
Right. A perfect engineer doesn't release a blueprint with faulty codes that need patching.
The human application of the law might shift as technology and society evolve, but the core systemic law itself cannot be abrogated.
Admitting that parts of the code are canceled destroys the entire premise of systemic perfection.
But human beings are incredibly resistant to this kind of pure rational mechanics, aren't they?
We really are.
We don't want to deal with the heavy math of social physics. We prefer aesthetics. We want our religion to look like religion.
Which perfectly illustrates why the author includes that brilliant, slightly absurd anecdote about the turban and the sherwani.
Oh, I really want to paint the picture of this anecdote because it is so incredibly relatable no matter what culture you come from.
It really is. Set the scene.
The author is recounting a time early in his career when he wrote a major, highly analytical essay. He was using this exact framework we've been talking about, applying rational clarity, challenging traditional interpretations, demanding systemic consistency.
And this essay causes a massive uproar in the traditional religious circles.
Huge uproar. So he ends up in a meeting with some very prominent religious scholars. Now, these are men who have ostensibly dedicated their entire lives to studying the text. They are the gatekeepers.
You would expect them to sit down, pull out his essay, and aggressively debate the linguistic roots, the geopolitical implications, the actual logic of his arguments.
That is not what happens.
Not at all.
They walk in, they take one look at him, and their primary overwhelming critique has absolutely nothing to do with his logic. Their problem is his wardrobe.
They are offended by his clothes.
Yes, the author is wearing regular Western-style everyday clothing, just a simple shirt and trousers, and these scholars essentially scold him.
What do they say?
They tell him, if you are going to presume to speak about the divine law, you must look the part. You must wear a sherwani, which is a traditional formal long coat. You must wear a turban on your head, and you must carry a rosary in your hand.
They are demanding the superficial markers of piety.
Exactly. And the author uses this incredibly frustrating moment to expose a massive psychological blind spot that plagues almost all human societies.
People become obsessed with the aesthetic packaging of a system.
Yes. They want the messenger to look like a wizard from antiquity. They obsess over the length of a beard, the specific fabric of a robe, the beads clutched in a hand.
But in obsessing over the costume, they become entirely blind to the actual practical, rational mechanics of the system being discussed.
It is a tragic comedy. These scholars are standing face to face with an intellectual trying to decipher the blueprint for civilizational survival, and they are criticizing the font the blueprint is printed in.
It goes right back to the opponents demanding miracles in verse 41.
It does. People want the aesthetic of the divine, the turban, the angels, the gold, because engaging with aesthetics requires zero intellectual heavy lifting.
Engaging with a Hukman Arabian, a clear, unbreakable, rational judgment, requires you to actually think, to analyze data, and to align your society's actions with reality.
And this raises the ultimate philosophical stakes of the author's argument. If this text isn't about magical turbans and mystical incantations...
If it is a clear, unchanging, rational law of physics.
Right. Where does it actually draw its authority from? Why should a modern civilization obey it?
According to the source, it draws its authority from the deepest, most fundamental operating system of the cosmos.
Which brings us to the core engine of this entire philosophy, the source code.
The author unpacks this by analyzing verse 39. This verse deals with a deeply complex philosophical concept, God erasing what he wills and establishing what he wills.
And it introduces a massive foundational term.
The ul-Kitab, the mother of the book.
Once again, the author takes a sledgehammer to the traditional translations here, because the traditional reading of God erasing what he wills creates a terrifying picture of reality.
It does. The traditional Orthodox interpretation often paints God as an arbitrary, omnipotent sovereign sitting on a throne, making moment-to-moment decisions based on inscrutable whims.
God erases what he wants, and he keeps what he wants.
Right. If he favors your empire today, you win the war. If he gets angry at you tomorrow, your empire is erased.
But logically, if the universe is run on the momentary whims of a cosmic dictator, then the idea of a rational clarity or a precision instrument is completely destroyed.
Exactly. You can't have an unbending mathematical law of social physics if the creator of that law is constantly changing the variables based on arbitrary desire.
It creates an unresolvable theological paradox.
But the author resolves this by arguing that the traditional translation fundamentally misunderstands the phrase, God's will.
So what is God's will in this context?
He argues that in the context of this blueprint, God's will is not an emotional desire or an arbitrary choice. God's will is the absolute, unchanging law of the universe.
So when the text says God erases or establishes based on his will, it's not a whim. It means he erases or establishes based on the unbending, pre-programmed mechanics he has set into motion.
Yes, the universe is running a program. And the source links this directly to what modern science would recognize as the laws of evolution and systemic survival.
The text introduces two opposing forces that govern this program, right? Batil and Hak.
These two words are the engine of the author's entire geopolitical theory. Let's break them down.
Let's do it.
In a traditional religious dictionary, Batil is simply translated as falsehood or evil, and Hak is translated as truth. They are treated as abstract moral concepts.
But the author defines them systemically and functionally.
He does. Batil is defined as anything that has lost its capacity to be constructive, functional, and beneficial to humanity.
So it's not just lying, it's uselessness.
Right. When a political system, an economic law, or a sprawling empire becomes purely destructive, parasitic, or stagnant, it becomes batil. it ceases to function.
And the universal law, God's will, is that Batil is eventually erased. It is naturally selected for extinction.
Just like a biological species that can no longer adapt to a changing environment.
Exactly. The dinosaurs weren't erased because the universe was morally angry at them. They were erased because their biological system lost the capacity to function in a new climate.
And conversely, hack is whatever retains the capacity to be constructive, beneficial, and functional. Whatever serves the progress and stability of human society remains established.
And the source material provides an incredible linguistic visual to ground this concept of hack. It proves that truth isn't just a philosophical idea floating in the clouds.
The author digs into the ancient Arabic root of the word hack. It originally referred to the physical socket, or the hinge, of a door.
A door hinge. That is so
Right.
brutally practical.
Think about the mechanics of a door. If the wooden door is carved perfectly to fit into the hinge, the hacket functions.
It swings open when you need to walk through, allowing progress.
It swings shut when you need security, providing safety. It perfectly fulfills the needs at a moment, is highly constructive.
But if the hinge is rusted out or the door is warped and doesn't fit the socket, it's jammed.
It's useless. It's batil.
In this framework, truth is not merely an abstract belief you hold in your heart or recite in a prayer. Truth is practical functionality.
Does your economic system fit the hinge of reality? Does your justice system produce constructive results for the marginalized?
If it does, it is hack, and the universal law dictates it will survive. If it doesn't, it is batil, and it will eventually be erased.
That is a devastating critique of modern institutions. You have massive political parties or religious organizations that claim to possess the ultimate truth, yet their actual governance produces nothing but misery, poverty, and stagnation.
The text is saying, your verbal claims are irrelevant. Your historical pedigree is irrelevant. The functional output is the only metric of truth the universe recognizes.
Which brings us to the ultimate repository of these laws, the Kitab, the mother of the book.
Right. If the universe runs on these unyielding physics of what is constructive and what is destructive, where are those laws actually written?
The author describes the Kitab as the ultimate statute book, or the primary source code of reality itself.
It is the master blueprint that contains the laws of astrophysics, the laws of cellular biology, and crucially, the immutable laws of human sociology.
It is the unchangeable operating system of the cosmos.
So, if the Kitab is the master server hosting the source code, what exactly is the Quran or any divine revelation in this specific context?
According to this systemic analysis, the revelation is essentially a download.
A download.
It is a specific, localized download of those fundamental, unchanging laws from the Kitab, translated and tailored specifically for human social application.
It is taking the physics of the universe and translating them into a constitution for statecraft?
Exactly.
So what does this actually mean for us, practically? It means you are living inside a heavily regulated machine. The universe isn't a dictatorship run on arbitrary whims, but it's also not a lawless void.
You cannot pray away the consequences of a corrupt banking system any more than you can pray away the law of gravity.
You cannot bribe the law of societal collapse. If your society adopts a batil system, one that is parasitic and out of alignment with the hinge of reality, you will be erased. Your borders will contract.
It completely strips away the magical thinking from human governance. You are absolutely bound by the physics of the system you build.
And here is the massive, glaring contradiction that every single listener is probably thinking about right now.
Let's hear it.
It's the ultimate friction point of human history. If this system is so mathematically perfect and the laws of Batil and Hawk are so unyielding, why do bad systems survive for so incredibly long?
That is the ultimate question.
We all see it. We see corrupt empires thrive for centuries. We see destructive corporate monopolies dominate the globe for decades before their borders even begin to contract.
Why isn't the feedback loop instantaneous?
Exactly. If a system is out of alignment with the hinge, why doesn't the door immediately fall off?
That tension, the agony of human impatience, is exactly what the final segment of the Sutta addresses. It introduces the concept of social physics, the ultimate witness, and the audit of history.
So the deep dive moves to the final verse of the chapter, verse 43, and the author introduces the mechanics of the divine calendar.
Yes. The historical opponents of the messenger were weaponizing the exact same question you just asked.
They mocked him.
They did. They said, you claim our economic system is batil. You claim our political structure is destructive and out of alignment with universal laws. So why hasn't destruction fallen upon us yet?
We are still wealthy. We still control the armies. Where is this erasure you keep threatening us with?
It is the classic arrogant taunt of entrenched power. If I'm so mathematically wrong, why am I winning?
And how does the text answer that?
To answer that, the source explains the concept of ajal. Ajal translates to a set term, a specific duration, or a deadline.
A deadline.
The author points out that in the physical universe, there is a natural, unavoidable delay between sowing a seed and reaping the harvest. You don't plant a grain of wheat on Monday and expect to bake bread on Tuesday.
There is an inescapable process of maturation required by the laws of biology.
And the author argues that the exact same maturation process applies to the seeds of societal destruction.
The universal system grants societies a respite. It's a grace period.
This period allows the system to fully run its course, for the systemic consequences to mature and become visible.
And crucially, it provides an opportunity for the society to observe the early warning signs and correct their course before the final catastrophic collapse.
The source material offers a profound commentary on our perception of time here, contrasting the human calendar with the divine calendar.
This is the key to understanding macrosociology, I think. Human intellect, by its very nature, relies on trial and error.
We invent a political system, it eventually fails, we suffer the consequences, and we try to invent a slightly better one.
We inch our way toward the truth over centuries of bloody mistakes. But because our individual lifespans are so brief, we only get 60, maybe 80 years on this planet, we demand instant results.
We want the corrupt tyrant to fall tomorrow afternoon. We want the flawed economic system to collapse within our own fiscal quarter so we can see justice done.
We measure history in news cycles and election terms. But the source points out that the divine calendar, the timeline of macro-societal evolution, operates on a completely different scale.
The text metaphorically states that a day in this system is like 1,000 years of human counting.
From the perspective of the Kitab, a century is barely a moment.
The audit of history is absolute, and it is inevitable. The bad system will collapse. The false accounting will be exposed. But the audit happens on a civilizational timescale, not a human one.
And misunderstanding how this calendar works leads to massive geopolitical and theological confusion. The source briefly touches upon specific historical movements to illustrate the danger of this impatience.
Yes, it mentions the emergence of figures like Mirza Ghulam Ahmad in India and the origins of the Baha'i faith in Persia during the 19th century.
We have to look at the historical context of the 19th century there. The major Islamic empires, the Ottomans, the Mughals were decaying rapidly.
Their borders were contracting violently under the pressure of European colonialism. They were experiencing the atref.
And in that atmosphere of civilizational despair, people felt that the old system had completely failed.
They felt the door had fallen off the hinge.
Exactly. And in that desperation, figures emerged claiming to bring new revelations or new eras of divine instruction.
The author analyzes their claims systemically, noting that they based their movement on a misunderstanding of a specific Quranic phrase. Every term has a decree, or every age has a book.
They interpreted that to mean, okay, the empire's falling, a new century has started, so the old book must be expired. We need a new book, we need a software update.
But the author argues they completely misdiagnosed the geopolitical illness because they didn't understand the divine calendar.
The phrase doesn't mean the foundational law changes every era.
No, it means that the results of the established unchanging law simply take an entire era to manifest.
You don't need a new book. You just need to wait for the harvest of the toxic seeds your ancestors planted centuries ago.
The law of physics didn't change. The delayed consequences finally arrived at their appointed ajal.
It's the difference between changing the rules of the game because you are losing versus finally tallying up the final score.
Precisely. The system was working perfectly. It was actively erasing a Batil society.
Which brings us to the climax of the entire surah, the final showdown.
Here we go.
The opponents, frustrated by the delay, relying entirely on their wealth and current power, finally draw a line in the sand. They declare to the messenger, "You are not sent by God. We reject your blueprint entirely."
And the response the text delivers here is, according to the author's framework, the definitive death of blind faith.
Verse 43 replies, "God is sufficient as a witness between me and you and those who have knowledge of the book."
If you read that with a traditional mystical mindset, it sounds like a resigned sigh. It sounds like, well, you don't believe me, but God knows I'm right in my heart. That's enough for me.
But the author argues for a fiercely empirical, hard-hitting interpretation. This is about verification through results.
What does it actually mean for the universal system for God to be a witness? In this sociological framework, God's witnessing is not passive observation from the clouds.
God as a witness means that the results of the divine law will inevitably manifest in physical reality.
It is a perceptual, empirical, historical witnessing.
It circles all the way back to the contracting borders. The proof of the system isn't lightning striking the opponents where they stand. The proof is the audit of history.
Over the centuries, the society that aligns with the Hukman Arabian, the rational clarity, the functional truth, will succeed, stabilize, and produce a constructive civilization.
And the old, arrogant empires running on flawed, partial systems of batil will slowly contract, decay, and fall into ruin.
History itself will take the stand and testify.
And the verse adds one final crucial detail. The witness includes those who have knowledge of the book. Who are they?
They aren't the people wearing the sherwani and holding the rosary.
No. They are the analysts, the historians, the people who deeply understand this systemic blueprint. They understand the mechanics of the Kitab.
Because they understand the sociology, they will be able to stand in the ruins of the failed empires, point to the historical data, and say, the blueprint worked.
The system predicted this exact collapse. The witness has testified.
It is the ultimate triumph of empirical verification over magical thinking.
It is breathtaking. Let's reflect on the massive journey you, the listener, have just taken through the architecture of Surah Ar-Ra'd.
Think about how this chapter started. It began with raw, overwhelming cosmic imagery, the thunder that gives the surah its name, the invisible pillars holding up the heavens.
It established the unbending physics of the cosmos.
And over the course of these verses, the text meticulously, systematically translated the physics of the heavens into the physics of human statecraft.
It moved from the power of a thunderstorm to the audit of history. It proved that the exact same unbreakable laws that govern the orbit of planets govern the rise and fall of human states.
We've arrived at the ultimate conclusion. Failing states shrink, borders contract, batil is erased, and the source code of reality is completely validated by time.
It is a heavy, almost intimidating analysis, but it sets the stage absolutely perfectly for what comes next in the source's progression.
Having spent all of Surah Ar-Ra'd proving the mechanics of how bad systems fall, how the door comes off the hinge, the text will now transition to showing what a successful system actually looks like when it aligns with reality.
Consider this your teaser for the next deep dive.
Our next exploration will take us into Surah Ibrahim, chapter 14. In that text, the source will show how these unchanging universal laws are personified in a powerful, grounded metaphor, the good tree.
It will detail the specific blueprint for a stable, flourishing, and immovable civilization.
We are moving from the brutal diagnosis of civilizational disease to the architecture of permanent health.
I cannot wait to unpack the good tree. But for now, we leave you with a final thought to mull over, building on the social physics we've decoded today.
The ultimate test.
If the ultimate proof of any society's validity is its long-term empirical survival and its constructive output, look closely at the microsystems governing your own life right now.
The institutions you rely on.
The political structures you vote for, the corporate cultures you work within, are they built to fit the unyielding hinge of reality? Are they producing constructive, functional truth?
Or are they deeply flawed systems, surviving only on borrowed time?
Completely reliant on the temporary silent patience of the divine calendar.
It's a question that demands a ruthless, honest audit.
Keep diving deep.